Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the corner of a bustling Miami diner, his unassuming presence a stark contrast to the chaos of the late-night crowd. Nearby, a bitter manager glared at a young waitress with venom in his eyes, his voice dripping with contempt. But what happened next would turn a grueling night shift into a moment no one saw coming, and change one woman's life in ways she never imagined. Before we unravel the full story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. If you're hooked on gripping tales like this, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we've got another unforgettable story waiting for you. Miami pulsed with life, a city where neon lights clashed with hidden shadows. It was a place of extremes, wealth and desperation, glamour and grit. And for Lucia Torres, it was a battlefield. At 27, she wasn't chasing dreams of fame or fortune. She was fighting to survive, to keep her family from falling apart. For 3 years, she'd worked at Sunshine Haven, a small, noisy diner tucked into a busy intersection. The air inside was thick with the smell of coffee and grease, the kind of place that never slowed down, even in the dead of night. Lucia wasn't a celebrity or someone anyone would notice. She was just a young woman with a weight on her shoulders that would have crushed most people. Her mother, Rosa, was confined to a bed at home, her heart failing her more each day. Her little brother Diego, only 11, didn't yet grasp why their fridge stayed empty or why Lucia came home every morning with dark circles under her eyes. She worked 14-hour shifts, her feet throbbing, her hands trembling from exhaustion, but she kept going. There was no other option. If she stopped, everything would collapse. Tonight was no different, or so she thought. It was another endless stretch of wiping tables, pouring coffee, and dodging the chaos of late-night customers. But something shifted when Victor, the diner's manager, approached her near the end of her shift. He was a wiry man with a fake smile and a temper that flared at the slightest inconvenience. "Lucia?" he barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the diner. "You're staying late this week. No pay for the extra hours. We're slammed, and I don't care if you're tired." His tone left no room for argument, but Lucia felt a fire ignite in her chest. She clenched her jaw, her hands tightening around the rag she was using to clean the counter. "I've been here since noon," she said, her voice low but steady. Victor's eyes narrowed, his smirk twisting into something uglier. "You think I give a damn? You want this job, you do what I say, end of story." Lucia stared at him, the unfairness of it clawing at her insides. She wanted to scream, to throw the rag in his face and walk out, but she couldn't. Rosa needed her medicine. Diego needed food. So she swallowed the anger, nodded stiffly, and turned back to her work. Every muscle in her body ached as she moved, her mind a blur of exhaustion and resentment. She'd been on her feet for hours, serving truckers, drunks, and night owls who barely left a tip. Her shoes were worn thin, her uniform stained with coffee she hadn't had time to wipe off. She didn't complain, not out loud anyway. Complaining didn't pay the bills, and it didn't keep the lights on. But deep down she felt the weight pressing harder every day, like a noose tightening around her neck. Victor hovered nearby, watching her with that smug look she hated. He thrived on control, on pushing people until they broke. Lucia had seen it before, new hires quitting after a week, unable to handle his demands, but she wasn't them. She couldn't afford to be. She thought of Rosa, propped up on pillows at home, her breathing shallow. She thought of Diego, asleep on a mattress on the floor, his small frame curled under a thin blanket. They were why she kept going, why she let Victor's words slide off her even as they burned. The clock ticked closer to midnight, but the diner stayed alive. Lucia moved faster, refilling coffee cups, clearing plates, ignoring the ache in her legs. She was used to it, used to the pain, the hunger she pushed aside, the endless grind. But tonight something felt off. Maybe it was the way Victor lingered, his eyes daring her to snap. Maybe it was the exhaustion finally cracking her resolve. Whatever it was, she didn't see the turning point coming. She didn't know that someone else was watching, not Victor, not the usual crowd, but a stranger in the corner booth. He'd slipped in quietly, unnoticed by most, and sat there with a cup of coffee he barely touched. Lucia hadn't paid him much attention, too caught up in her own fight. But he saw her. He saw the way she moved, the way she held herself together when everything else was falling apart. And he wasn't just any stranger. He was Keanu Reeves. A man whose name carried weight, whose presence could shift fates. For now, though, he was just a shadow in the diner, waiting for the moment that would change Lucia's life forever. As she scrubbed a sticky table, Victor's voice cut through again. "Move faster, Lucia, you're dragging us down." She bit her lip so hard she tasted blood, forcing herself to stay silent. She didn't know how much longer she could take it, his taunts, the unpaid hours, the sheer unfairness of it all. But she kept moving, kept fighting, because that's what she did, that's who she was. And tonight, that fight was about to catch someone's eye in a way she never could have predicted. The clock above the counter ticked past 11:45 p.m., but Sunshine Haven showed no signs of slowing down. Lucia Torres darted between tables, her hands full with a tray of empty plates and coffee mugs. The diner buzzed with the usual late-night crowd, truckers nursing black coffee, a couple of drunks laughing too loud, and a handful of tired workers grabbing a cheap bite before heading home. She barely registered the ache in her legs anymore. It was just part of the job, part of her life. Her focus was on getting through the shift, surviving another night. Then she noticed him, a man sitting alone in the corner booth, tucked away from the chaos. He wore a black jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, blending into the dim light like he didn't want to be seen. His hands were wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, but he hadn't taken a sip in a while. Lucia caught his gaze for a split second. Dark, steady, watching her. It wasn't the usual stare she got from customers, the kind that made her skin crawl. This was different, quieter, like he was studying her. She shook it off, too tired to care, and turned back to her work. The night wore on, the hours blurring together in a haze of refills and small talk. Lucia was wiping down the counter when a soft voice broke through the noise. "Lucia?" She turned to see Carla, the newest waitress, hovering nearby. Carla was barely 19, her face pale and her hands fidgeting nervously. Can I talk to you for a sec?" she whispered, glancing over her shoulder like she was scared someone might hear. Lucia nodded, stepping closer. "What's up?" Carla's eyes darted to the floor, her voice barely audible. "I don't have anything at home, no food, nothing. I was wondering, could I maybe take some leftovers? Just something small?" Her cheeks flushed with shame and Lucia's heart twisted. She knew that look. Hunger, desperation, the kind she'd felt too many times herself. Without a word, she grabbed a takeout container from under the counter and started filling it, some leftover bread, a scoop of pasta, whatever wouldn't be missed. She was halfway done when Victor's voice sliced through the air like a knife. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Lucia?" He stormed over, his face twisted with rage. Before she could react, he snatched the container from her hands and flung it to the floor. The plastic cracked, spilling food across the tiles. Carla flinched, tears welling up, and Lucia felt her stomach drop. "This isn't a damn charity," Victor shouted, his breath hot with anger. "You think you can just give my stock away?" Lucia squared her shoulders, stepping between him and Carla. "She's hungry, Victor. It's just scraps. Stuff we'd throw out anyway." Her voice was steady, but inside she was shaking. Victor's eyes narrowed, his lip curling into a sneer. "I don't care if she's starving. You don't get to play hero on my dime. You're lucky I don't fire you right now." He jabbed a finger at her chest close enough that she could smell the stale cigarette smoke on him. "Get back to work, or you're done." The diner went quiet, every pair of eyes on them. Carla whimpered, shrinking back, and Lucia felt a surge of fury she could barely contain. "If you're going to fire me, do it," she snapped, her voice rising. "But don't pretend you care about this place when all you do is squeeze us dry." Victor's face darkened, his hand twitching like he might hit her. For a moment they stood there, locked in a standoff, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then he laughed, a cold, bitter sound. "You're not worth the paperwork," he spat. "Clean this mess up and get moving." Lucia knelt to pick up the scattered food, her hands trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. Carla whispered a shaky, "Thank you," but Lucia barely heard her. She was too focused on keeping herself together, on not giving Victor the satisfaction of seeing her break. As she stood, she caught a glimpse of the man in the corner again. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were still on her, sharper now, like he'd just seen something he couldn't unsee. KeanuReeves took a slow sip of his coffee, the steam long gone. He'd come to Sunshine Haven on a whim, looking for a quiet spot to think. But what he'd found was Lucia. He watched her work herself to the bone, her every move a testament to a strength most people never noticed. And then that moment, the way she'd stood up for Carla, the way she'd faced down Victor without flinching, even when she had everything to lose, it hit him hard. This wasn't just another tired waitress in a dead-end job. This was someone fighting a war no one else saw. He set the cup down, his mind made up. Most people in Miami were too wrapped up in their own lives to care about someone like Lucia, but Keanu wasn't most people. He'd always had a knack for spotting the ones who didn't give up, the ones who deserved more than they got. And tonight, he'd seen enough. As Lucia turned back to the counter, forcing herself to keep going, Keanu leaned forward slightly, his decision settling in. He wasn't leaving this diner without doing something. Something that would pull her out of the shadows she'd been forced to live in. Lucia Torres stepped out of Sunshine Haven at 2 a.m., the Miami night wrapping around her like a cold, damp blanket. Her shift had dragged on 20 minutes late thanks to Victor's last-minute demands, but she was used to it. The streets were quieter now, the roar of traffic dulled to a low hum. Neon signs flickered faintly in the distance, casting weak light across the cracked pavement. She adjusted the strap of her worn-out bag, her body screaming for rest, and started the long walk home. It was cheaper than a bus, and every dollar counted. She hadn't gone far when she felt it, a prickling at the back of her neck, like someone was watching her. She wasn't paranoid, not usually, but the sensation grew stronger with every step. Her pulse quickened, and she glanced over her shoulder. The street was mostly empty, just a few shadows shifting in the dark. Then she saw him, a figure in a dark jacket, walking a block behind her. He wasn't rushing, wasn't hiding, but he was definitely following her. Lucia's fingers tightened around her bag strap, her breath hitching. Miami wasn't safe at this hour, not for a woman alone. She picked up her pace, her sneakers slapping against the concrete. The man matched her speed, closing the gap just enough to keep her in sight. Her heart pounded now, fear clawing up her spine. Home wasn't far, but there was an alley shortcut ahead, dark, narrow, risky. She hesitated, then decided against it. If he was trouble, she'd rather stay in the open. She turned a corner, hoping to lose him, but his footsteps echoed behind her, steady and deliberate. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She stopped dead in her tracks and spun around, her voice cutting through the silence. "What do you want?" she demanded, louder than she meant to. The man froze, raising his hand slightly as if to calm her. "Wait," he said, his voice deep but soft. "I'm not trying to scare you." He stepped closer, into the faint glow of a streetlight, and Lucia's breath caught. It was the guy from the diner, the quiet one in the corner booth. Up close, there was something familiar about him, something she couldn't place. "Why are you following me?" she snapped, her fear morphing into anger. He hesitated, then reached up and pulled off his cap. The light hit his face and Lucia's world tilted. Keanu Reeves stood in front of her, his expression calm but intense. She blinked, then blinked again, her exhausted brain struggling to process it. She started, but the words stuck in her throat. "Yeah," he said with a small, almost sheepish smile. "I'm Keanu." Lucia shook her head, disbelief warring with confusion. "Okay, wait. What the hell is going on? Am I hallucinating? Did Victor slip something into my coffee?" Keanu chuckled, a low, warm sound that cut through the tension. "You're not hallucinating, I promise." She crossed her arms, still wary. "Then why are you tailing me at 2 a.m? He took a breath, his gaze steady on hers. "I saw you back there, at the diner. The way you handled that jerk manager, the way you helped that girl without even thinking about it. You didn't back down even when you could have lost everything. I wanted to know more about you." Lucia's chest tightened, her defenses kicking in hard. "So what? You're some rich guy playing detective? I don't need your pity." Her voice was sharp, edged with pride she'd spent years building. Keanu shook his head, stepping closer but keeping his hands visible. "It's not pity. It's respect. I've seen a lot of people give up under less than what you're carrying. You don't." She stared at him, torn between wanting to believe him and the instinct to push him away. "You don't know me," she said finally, her tone softer but still guarded. "You don't know what I'm carrying." Keanu nodded, like he'd expected that. "Maybe not, but I'd like to." Before she could respond, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small grocery bag. Milk, bread, a few cans of soup. He set it on the ground between them. "For your family," he said simply. Lucia's throat closed up. She looked at the bag, then back at him, her pride warring with the reality of her empty fridge. "I don't take handouts," she said, but her voice wavered. Keanu didn't flinch. "It's not a handout, it's a start. You've been fighting alone too long." He paused, then added, "I heard you mention your mom's sick. I've got a friend, a doctor. I can get her help, no strings." Her eyes stung, and she hated it. She'd spent years refusing help, proving she could handle it all. Rosa's meds, Diego's school supplies, the rent that never stopped climbing. But now, standing here with Keanu Reeves of all people, she felt the cracks in her armor. "Why?" she whispered, barely audible. "Why me?" Keanu met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "Because people like you, the ones who keep going when life's kicking them down, they're the real deal, and I think your story's worth knowing." Lucia swallowed hard, the bag of groceries still sitting there like a challenge. She didn't say yes, not yet, but she didn't walk away either. And for Keanu, that was enough. He'd made his move. Now it was up to her. A few days after their late-night encounter, Keanu Reeves showed up at Sunshine Haven again, this time just before Lucia's shift ended. She spotted him waiting by the door, his hands in his pockets, looking as unassuming as ever despite who he was. She wiped her hands on her apron, still unsure about him but too curious to ignore him. "What now?" she asked, half expecting another grocery bag. Instead, he gave her a small, serious nod. "I've got something for you. A job. A real one. La Perla Azul, downtown. High-end place. They need someone tough. Someone who doesn't quit. You in?" Lucia's stomach flipped. La Perla Azul wasn't just any restaurant. It was a Miami hotspot, the kind of place where the rich ate and critics raved. She'd never even stepped inside a place like that, let alone worked there. "I'm not a chef," she said, her voice tight. "I sling coffee and burgers." Keanu shrugged. "You don't need a fancy degree. You got grit. That's what they want. Just show up tomorrow, 6 a.m., ask for Chef Elena." Before she could argue, he handed her a slip of paper with an address and walked off, leaving her staring at it like it might burn her. The next morning, Lucia stood outside La Perla Azul, her palms sweaty and her heart hammering. The building gleamed, polished glass doors, sleek lines, a far cry from the grimy diner she knew. She smoothed her second-hand blouse, took a deep breath, and walked in. The kitchen hit her like a storm. Chefs in crisp white uniforms, the clatter of pans, the sharp scent of garlic and butter. Chef Elena, a tall woman with a no-nonsense stare, sized her up. "Keanu says you're worth a shot," she said. "Don't make me regret this. You're on prep. Move." Lucia nodded, grabbing an apron, and dove in. She'd barely started chopping onions when she felt eyes on her. Javier Ruiz, a senior line cook, leaned against a counter nearby, arms crossed, smirking. He was in his 30s, wiry, with a sharp jaw and a reputation for being one of the best in the kitchen. "So, you're the charity case," he said, loud enough for others to hear. Lucia kept her head down, focusing on her knife. "I'm here to work," she replied, her tone flat. Avi snorted, "Sure you are. Let's see how long you last." The day was brutal. Lucia diced vegetables, shelled shrimp, scrubbed stations, every task thrown at her like a test. She was fast, thanks to years at the diner, but this was different. Everything had to be perfect, and the pace never let up. Then it happened. She'd just finished plating a garnish for a lunch order, asparagus spears, glazed and precise, when Javier brushed past her, his elbow knocking the plate to the floor. The crash silenced the kitchen. "Oops," he said, his grin venomous. "Better hurry, newbie. Chef's coming." Lucien's blood boiled. She glanced at the mess, then at Javier, who was already walking away. She had seconds before Chef Elena noticed, seconds before this could end her. She didn't think, she acted. Grabbing fresh asparagus, she sliced it with lightning speed, her hands steady despite the adrenaline. She melted butter in a pan, added a splash of lemon, and plated it just as Elena approached. The chef picked up the dish, inspected it, then moved on without a word. Lucia exhaled, her legs shaking. She'd dodged disaster, but when she looked at Javier, his smirk was gone. replaced by a flicker of irritation. But he didn't stop there. Later, during the dinner rush, Lucia was assigned to sauce prep. She'd just finished a batch of bechamel when Javier accidentally bumped her arm, spilling half of it across the counter. "You're a mess," he muttered, loud enough for the sous chef to hear. The sous chef barked, "Torres, clean it up. If you can't handle this, you're out." Lucia clenched her jaw, mopping up the spill while Javier watched, smug. She wanted to shove him, to scream, but she didn't. She made a new batch, her hands raw from the heat, and delivered it on time. The sous chef grunted approval, and Javier's eyes darkened. By the end of the shift, Lucia was bone-tired, her apron stained, her fingers nicked from rushing. Javier cornered her as she wiped down her station. "You don't belong here," he hissed, stepping close. "Keanu might have gotten you in, but I'll make sure you crash and burn. I've seen his type, helping losers like you like he did me. Didn't work out for me, won't for you." Lucia met his gaze, her voice low and hard. "I'm not you, Javier. I don't quit," he laughed, cold and sharp. "We'll see." She didn't flinch. Didn't back down. She'd fought worse than him. Victor, hunger, despair. And she'd won every time. Javier stalked off, but the air between them crackled with tension. This wasn't over. Lucia straightened, exhaustion warring with a fire she hadn't felt in years. La Perla Azul was her shot, and no jealous cook was going to take it from her. She'd prove it. To Javier, to Chef Elena, to herself. Tomorrow she'd come back stronger. Months flew by, and Lucia Torres transformed at La Perla Azul. She'd started as the shaky prep cook, dodging Javier's sabotage, but now she was a force. Steady, precise, unbreakable. Chef Elena noticed, giving her more responsibility, sauces, plating, even a shot at the line during quieter shifts. Lucia soaked it up, her hands calloused but her spirit blazing. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was building something. Keanu checked in sometimes, dropping by with a quiet nod or a quick, "How's it going?" He never lingered, but his belief in her kept her pushing forward. Then came the big move. One night, after a grueling shift, Keanu pulled her aside. "I've got a friend opening a new spot," he said, his voice low. "It's yours, if you want it. Not just a job, a restaurant, your name on it." Lucia stared at him, her breath catching. "Mine?" she whispered. He nodded. "You've earned it. I'll back you, but the heart of it? That's you." It was insane, a dream she'd never dared to dream, but she said yes. With Keanu's help, Luz Eterna was born, a small, vibrant place in Miami's heart, serving dishes that told her story. Handmade tortillas, bold salsas, comfort food with soul. Opening night was electric, the place was packed. Locals, foodies, even a few critics. Diego, now 12, sat at the best table in his first suit, grinning ear to ear. Rosa, frail but radiant, watched from a cushioned chair, tears in her eyes as Lucia worked the room. Keanu was there too, leaning against the bar with a beer, his quiet smile saying more than words ever could. Luz Eterna wasn't just a restaurant, it was proof Lucia had clawed her way out of the dark. She'd done the impossible, and the night felt like a victory lap. But victory didn't come without a fight. As the crowd thinned and the kitchen slowed, the front door slammed open. Javier Ruiz stumbled in, his face flushed with liquor and fury. Heads turned, conversations dying as he staggered toward the bar. "You think you're special, huh?" he slurred, pointing at Lucia. She froze, her apron still on, hands sticky from plating desserts. "What are you doing here, Javier?" she asked, her voice tight. He laughed, a jagged, bitter sound. "Keanu's little project. That's all you are. Just like me." He lurched closer, knocking over a chair. "He helped me too, you know, years ago. Gave me a shot at a kitchen, said I had potential, but when I screwed up, when I couldn't hack it, he dropped me. Left me to rot." His eyes burned into Lucia's, wild with resentment. "Now he's got you, his shiny new toy. Bet he didn't tell you how he bails when you fail." Lucia's stomach twisted. She glanced at Keanu, who'd stepped forward, his jaw tight. "That's not true, Javier," he said, his tone calm but firm. "You gave up, I didn't." Javier spun on him, fists clenched. "Bullshit, you walked away, left me with nothing, and now you're here, playing savior again? I'll burn this place down before I let her have what I didn't." He lunged at Keanu, but Lucia moved faster. She grabbed Javier's arm, yanking him back with a strength she didn't know she had. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice echoing through the room. "You don't get to blame him, or me, for your mess. I fought for this. You want to tear it down, you'll have to go through me." Javier struggled, but she held firm, her eyes blazing. For a moment he glared at her, then deflated, the fight draining out of him. He shook her off and stumbled out, leaving silence in his wake. The next morning, Lucia arrived at Luz Eterna to clean up, her mind still reeling. Javier's words gnawed at her. Had Keanu really abandoned him? She needed answers. But when she got there, Keanu was gone. No sign of him, no goodbye, just a folded note on the counter, her name scrawled across it in his messy handwriting. She opened it, her hands trembling. "Lucia, you did this, not me. I didn't stick around because I don't need the spotlight. I never did. I helped you because I saw you, the way I wish someone had seen me when I hit bottom. Lost everything once, family, hope, myself. Couldn't save them, but maybe I could save someone else. You're not a project. You're proof people can rise. Keep burning bright. You don't need me anymore. Keanu." Lucia's chest ached as she read it, tears blurring the ink. He wasn't a hero riding in to fix her life. He was a man haunted by his own ghosts, trying to make amends through her. She'd thought he'd stay, thought he'd bask in her success, but he'd slipped away instead, leaving her to stand alone. She folded the note, tucking it into her pocket, and looked around Luz Eterna. The tables, the kitchen, the life she'd built. It was hers, not his. Ajaye was wrong. Keanu hadn't abandoned her. He'd set her free. She stepped outside, the Miami sun warming her face. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of the past. She felt the fire of the future, hers to shape, hers to fight for. Keanu's story was his own, but this one? This was hers. Lucia's journey teaches us that true strength isn't loud or flashy. It's the quiet fire that keeps burning through life's darkest moments. She didn't wait for a savior. She fought for her own light, proving that resilience and kindness can rewrite any story. In our lives, it's a reminder. Don't let setbacks define you. Build your own path, even when the odds stack high. Thanks for joining us on this ride. Your support keeps these tales alive. Drop a comment. What's your takeaway? Subscribe and hit the bell. We've got more stories coming your way tomorrow.